Are you tired of shame and secrets, wishing you could let them go? Do you feel like an orphan searching for a home? Well, there's a love that fills what's empty. There's a place you can be changed. There's a God who knows you. He's calling out your name. Come on down to the river. Come be washed in the blood, and your sin will be forgiven by the power of His love. Come be changed by the mercy that makes all things new. Where the lost get found. Come on down, down, down to the river. To the river. It flows like the Mississippi from the giver of endless grace. And everyone is welcome here to dive into the waves. So leave the questions far behind you. Leave your past back on the shore and run with wild abandon. Wait no more. Come on down to the river. Come be washed in the blood, and your sin will be forgiven by the power of His love. Come be changed by the mercy that makes all things new. Where the lost get found. Come on down, down, down to the river. To the river. Every burden, every scar, let the waters wash away. No matter who you were before, you belong to Christ today. Yeah, you belong to Christ today. As I went down to the river to pray, studying about thy good old way, and who shall wear the robe and crown? Good Lord, show me the way. Oh, sister, let's go down, let's go down, come on down. Oh, sister, let's go down, down to the river to pray. Come on down to the river, come be washed in the blood, and your sins will be forgiven by the power of His love. Be changed by the mercy that makes all things new. Where the lost get found. Come on down, down, down to the river. To the river. Come on down, come on down. To the river.
Some place where there isn't any trouble. Do you suppose there is such a place, Toto? There must be. It's not a place you can get to by a boat or a train. It's far, far away. Behind the moon, beyond the rain. Somewhere over the rainbow, way up high, there's a land that I heard of once in a lullaby. Somewhere over the rainbow, skies are upon a star and wake up where the clouds are far behind me. Where troubles melt like lemon drops away above the chimney tops, that's where you'll find me. Somewhere over the rainbow, bluebirds fly over the rainbow. Why then, oh, why can't I? If happy little bluebirds fly beyond the rainbow, why, oh, why can't I?
Good evening. It is great to be with you tonight. My name is David Vasquez-Levy, and I serve as president at Pacific School of Religion. Thank you for joining us for tonight's Boswell lecture, Enfleshing Eros, Healing Earth. We are delighted to have the Reverend Dr. Jay Johnson, PSR Professor of Theology and Culture, serving as our 13th Boswell lecture speaker. We gather virtually tonight as the COVID-19 reality has reminded us of the inescapable reality of our interconnectedness. We have been reminded of it both in its painful implications on all of our lives, but also in the implications for the environment, in the sudden halt in our unsustainable consumption of resources that the virus has occasioned. The disproportionate impact of the pandemic on communities of color and other marginalized communities highlights the critical importance of the work we are committed to through CLGS and PSR to prepare a diverse cadre of spiritually rooted changemakers with the vision, resilience, and skill to create a world where all can thrive. This moment requires the kind of cross-sectoral responses, the queering of boundaries that PSR and CLGS have been committed to for a very long time. In the knowledge that our best responses come in the valleys between disciplines, fields, and sectors. That is certainly the case for tonight's lecture. This coming academic year, we will celebrate the 20th anniversary of CLGS's remarkable work. We hope that you will join us throughout next year for special events to mark this anniversary, including the opportunity for the first time to participate through distance learning in our certificate for sexuality and religion that is made possible through the work of PSR and CLGS. Please visit our website to learn more about this opportunity. Let me introduce to you Bernie Schlager. Dr. Bernie Schlager is PSR Associate Professor of Historical and Cultural Studies and Executive Director of the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion. Again, thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, President David Vasquez-Levy. Again, my name is Bernie Schlager, and I serve as Executive Director of CLGS, the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion, here at Pacific School of Religion. So let me be the third person tonight to welcome you to the 13th annual CLGS Johnny Boswell Lecture with Professor J. Emerson Johnson as our lecturer for this year. The Reverend Dr. J. Emerson Johnson came to Pacific School of Religion way back in 2003 as the programming director for CLGS. Since then, Jay has served as a coordinator of our Certificate of Sexuality and Religion program and helped to launch what is now PSR's Ignite Institute. Currently Professor of Theology and Culture here at the seminary, Jay is also a member of the core doctoral faculty at the Graduate Theological Union, where he recently serves as chair of the Theology and Ethics Department. He also coordinates the Certificate of Spirituality and Social Change program here and directs the seminary's Master of Arts degree in social transformation. Professor Johnson has served in the American Academy of Religion as a member of the steering committee of the Gay Men's Issues in Religion group and co-chair of that group from 2001 through 2007. And Jay continues to serve on the editorial board of the journal Theology and Sexuality. In addition to numerous journal articles and essays, he is the author as well of Dancing with God, Anglican Christianity and the Practice of Hope, Divine Communion, a Eucharistic Theology of Sexual Intimacy, and Peculiar Faith, Queer Theology for Christian Witness with Daniel Boisvert. Jay is also the co-editor of the 2-volume anthology Queer Religion. Professor Johnson has been serving as a member of the associate clergy at the Episcopal Church of the Good Shepherd here in Berkeley since 1992. Welcome, Professor Johnson. We are honored by your virtual presence among us. The John E. Boswell Lecture is an endowed lectureship established at CLGS in 2007 with the aim of bringing leading scholars in religion, gender, and sexuality studies to the PSR campus or website each spring. In considering the continuing impact of Professor Boswell's scholarship in the fields of history, religion, gender, and sexuality studies, I'm reminded of a remark from his groundbreaking 1980 book, Christianity, Social Tolerance and Homosexuality, Gay People in Western Europe from the beginning of the Christian era to the 14th century, in which Boswell tells their reader that the mark of a true scholar is one who acknowledges with humility that their scholarship, however good and however exemplary, is by its very nature never the last word on any given subject. What inspired us here at the center to name our annual spring lecture series after John Boswell was, in great part, their willingness to take risks in their scholarship and face those who criticized and even dismissed Boswell's work, largely because they chose to write about something that many believed was best left not discussed, something best left in the closet. That is the history of queer people and Christianity. And many laughed at Boswell's claim that there is nothing inherently anti-gay, today we would say anti-queer, in Christianity itself. Such a claim was seen 30 or 40 years ago, and still today, as heretical by some who refused even to entertain the possibility that the Christian tradition has not always and not everywhere stigmatized and persecuted us queer people. In fact, Boswell claimed there were eras in church history when same-gender loving people and their cultures were not only tolerated, but indeed celebrated. And so as I conclude our introductory remarks this evening or tonight or this morning, wherever you are, I welcome you all once again in the spirit of John Boswell and his remarkable scholarship to CLGS's 13th annual John E. Boswell Lecture. And I am proud, so proud to present now to you Professor Jay Johnson, who will speak to us this evening on Enfleshing Eros, Healing Earth, a queerly Christian performance of ecological renewal in 3 acts.
Dr. Schlager, thank you, Bernie, very much for that kind introduction. And it is absolute delight to be here this evening, actually to be at home this evening and Zooming to wherever you may be. Thank you for Zooming in tonight for this lecture. I want to start with a very brief, if I can share my screen, PowerPoint. Which will not last but a few moments, because I want to begin by offering a visual overture with words, if you will, inviting you to imagine Jesus as he stands naked, waist deep in water. John the Baptist, also naked, stands behind Jesus, the baptizer's right hand resting on his cousin's right shoulder. John's face is partially occluded as he bends forward, apparently whispering something in Jesus's ear. The physical closeness of these two figures speaks a tender intimacy, tender and also expectant. Yet Jesus looks blankly forward, his eyes fixed on a distant object, or perhaps turned inward, gazing on nothing at all. musing perhaps on the felicity and the oddity alike of that baptismal moment, the surrounding desert, the legendary stories of the Jordan River and the history of his people, the physical proximity of John, his cousin, and the riveting stories of their strange births. The painter of this scene borrowed from ancient styles of iconography, similar to what you see here on your screen, mixed with a few neoclassical touches for this iconic moment on a large canvas, roughly 8 by 5 feet, as I recall. I'm referring to a painting, not the one you see here. I'm referring to a painting that occupied fully the sidewalk window of a small gallery on Market Street in San Francisco, directly across from a gay bar. The bar remains to this day. It's called Martuni's, but the gallery has long since closed. I want to just show you a few other images. There are many images of the baptism of Jesus by John, his cousin. These are just a few of them from different cultural locations, different times, different places. None of these that I just showed you is the one I am referring to this evening. I ache with regret that I never learned the artist's name, and I have lost touch with whatever happened to that painting that I gazed upon so rapturously, my nose pressed against glass. I do recall short snippets of conversation, small talk among other gay men who would occasionally pass by the gallery as I stood there. Some of them made lewd jokes about the scene, likely in response to the image of 2 apparently naked men in such a tableau of physical intimacy. Banter of that kind, often slurred with cocktails, was shared between urban gay men who saw mostly institutional histories of religious condemnation in that image. What did I see there? What drew me so incessantly to that image of physical intimacy, the bodily proximity of the figures, and their tender touch of flesh on flesh in water under sky? I stood there at the gallery window for more evenings than I can count. It was never during daylight. The darkness of the city streets contrasted with the luminous strokes of paint. No single light source illumined the scene in that painter's imagination, apparently. Light came from everywhere and nowhere, perhaps from all around the figures or from inside them. Or maybe, I thought, the light is being coaxed out of me by the erotic pose of the figures. I will return to that painting twice more this evening to invite reflection on its implications for a moment when the ecosystems of Earth are struggling and suffering. Although more recently, in these weeks of a pandemic slowdown, exhibiting the kind of healing many of us have only fantasized might be possible. But first, I want to say how grateful I am for this invitation to deliver the 13th annual John E. Boswell Lecture. Professor Boswell's work, and indeed his life and academic position, made a lasting impact on me, to put the matter mildly. His work was part of what saved my life as a young gay Christian and seminarian. To deliver a lecture named in his honor is startling and deeply moving and not a little intimidating. Now, that may seem odd to say about the scholarly work of history, about a scholar of time and place, and yet the work of critically and constructively retrieving a shared past is indispensable for a sustainable present and a viable future. in that vein, it is imperative that we remember this evening and name the migratory patterns, colonial occupations, and violent conquests that have transpired on the land where Pacific School of Religion sits, and to recall the Ohlone people who made this part of California their home long before Europeans arrived. Now, they were, of course, but a small fraction of the estimated 20 million indigenous people of the Americas killed by the Spanish conquistadors. Let us also take note this evening of the many other species, both plant and animal, that have been displaced from this land by humans or lost over the centuries because of human habitations. This includes the habitations of the indigenous as well as the colonizer. I want to be very clear about this. I am not suggesting any equivalence between those ecological footprints. I am, however, urging us not to idealize or romanticize the so-called indigenous on any continent. As a growing number of researchers in a variety of disciplines would have us understand, from the perspective of Earth's ecosystems, human beings have not been a friendly nor merely a benign presence on this planet at hardly any time in the history of Homo sapiens. From an evolutionary point of view, we have yet to learn how to live harmoniously with the environments that give us life. So I offer this lecture in that larger frame as I seek to render LGBTQ sensibilities, racial and economic justice, and ecological spirituality as a single fabric of concern and commitment. Separating those is not merely bad academic form. Such separation has now led us, all of us, into the existential crisis of catastrophic climate change, of which the current coronavirus pandemic is but a symptom. And so I turn now to a brief introduction of Boswell's work, especially the so-called Boswell thesis, as it relates to my own related thesis concerning what I want to propose this evening about an ecological eros. One of the gifts of having been asked to deliver this lecture has been going back to my dog-eared copy of Boswell's Christianity, Social Tolerance, and Homosexuality that Dr. Schlager just mentioned, and recall, as I went through it again, that I did not merely learn something new from him and then move on. For more than 30 years, I have returned often in my work as a theologian to what he taught me as a historian concerning texts and methods. Boswell's work startled and transformed, as we heard from Dr. Schlager a moment ago, in large measure because it invited LGBT Christians to suppose that the question of our inclusion in Christian churches is the wrong question, since we are already there and always have been. This matters because when we suppose that we have not always already been woven into the body of Christ, into church, we fail to notice the violence that has been done to us, both body and soul, in treating us as severed limbs of that body, which, by the way, is to perpetuate damage on the whole body and not only on those of us marked as queer. Thus, the indispensable work of the historian, the vital significance of memory, of remembering in a world riddled with dismemberments. That work, which is actually the work of healing, contributed to what has been called, both with admiration and disdain, depending on your point of view, the Boswell thesis. That thesis is simply and profoundly this: Christianity has not been consistently opposed to what we today would call gay and lesbian people, perhaps also bisexual and transgender people. Queer people and queer relationships actually populate the history of Christian ideas and practice, in ways that have been straightened by modern institutional structures. I am not suggesting, nor did Boswell wish to imply, that pre-modern Christianity qualified as a religious paradise for sexually queer and queerly gendered people. It clearly was not. But because those earlier, even classical traditions of Christian thought and practice were also not uniformly opposed, much less terrified by queer bodies and their practices, we might yet glean something indispensable for our own day from those traditions, not only for LGBT people who continue to live as targets of religious violence, but indeed for the precious ecosystems of this planet that give all of us life. What Boswell helped to set in motion, in other words, is the surfacing of vital insights from Christian traditions that may not bear directly on LGBT concerns as such, but also might not have appeared with such vitality had we not been engaged in a decades-long ecclesial wrestling match over sexual ethics. The God of Easter never fails to bring forth new life, in other words. Now, one of the capacious insights that began to take shape in this process by pondering the theological and spiritual significance of sex itself. I don't mean the ethics of sex. I mean whether we can articulate a theological significance for sexual desire and adopt a spiritual posture toward its practice. While whole books have been written on this, I may have done so myself, the insight comes down to this. There is more to sex than making babies, and there is more to erotic desire than having sex. And what lesbian and gay relationships have provoked, at least in some religious circles, is the galvanizing notion that eros is not only a permissible, but is actually a foundational way to describe God's own divine energy of love that knits together the very fabric of the cosmos. I am persuaded that queer people bear witness to this indispensable insight, which we must now offer as strategically and effectively as we can for the healing of Earth. The biblical writer in Genesis points in this direction concerning what many Christians refer to as the fall, which was not caused by sex. Erase that part of the tape that plays in your brain about it. The biblical writer does not say sex caused the fall. The biblical writer does say the fall is shame about sex. More pointedly, shame itself can be understood as the fall, insofar as it severs relational intimacy, which it does, as the biblical writer also noted, with the land itself. As many queer people of faith can attest, our lives of religious acceptance have been accompanied by the gradual realization that erotic desire is actually a vital source of our own healing. Healing from bodily shame, healing from isolation and alienation, healing from the effects of the hostility and violence fueled by the categorical classification schemes that divide, segment, and fragment. It is precisely this embrace of Eros as a path toward healing that we as a species must now adopt in our shared efforts toward ecological renewal. That is what I want us to consider tonight. Now, as the subtitle of this lecture suggests, I want to present that path as one of erotic performance. And for those hoping for singing and tap dancing, I apologize for the false advertising. I mean by performance to evoke what many queer theorists would have us consider about the networks of our relationships and behaviors that constitute who we are. These are not static essences in the way the modern West has come to think of identities. They are instead dynamic manifestations of interrelationality, the vulnerabilities and ecstasies, the tragedies and triumphs of intertwined organisms. These dynamics, furthermore, are best organized within the frame of what some ancient Greeks conceived of as erotic yearning. I do not mean to suggest that there is a self-evident and pristine definition of eros, which we can now handily retrieve from the ancient Greeks for our purposes today. Instead, what lesbian and gay projects, including theological ones, have helped to name is the rich multiplicity, textured diversity of eros in both Eastern and Western traditions that have repeatedly inflected particular strands of Christian theological ideas and spiritual practice. My own reading of some of these ancient Greek sources and their contemporary interpretations, including, by the way, and it shouldn't be just by the way, including the brilliant innovations and inimitable witness to the transformative effects of the erotic offered by Audre Lorde, has led me to define eros as the foundational desire for encounter, intimacy, and union. These, I want to propose this evening, are the three acts of an erotic posture toward Earth's intertwined ecosystems and their countless interdependent species that can and must animate communities of healing and renewal for ourselves and for Earth. And so, Act 1, encounter. Modern Western society is stratified with silos for the benefit of the few at the expense of the many. The gaps between these silos are filled with animosity. I mean, of course, the silos of race, class, ethnicity, gender, and sexuality. I would urge us to consider further that the category species defines the very notion of a silo at all. This means, in turn, that the silos we all inhabit can be dismantled and new depths of solidarity achieved only by means of an ecological hermeneutic and an environmentally shaped commitment to justice. This is so because the ideological and institutional forces that separate us from each other as humans are derived from and depend on the prior separation we suffer and then learn to tolerate between us and other animals and the ecosystems we all share on this one planet. Encountering others in their otherness, as Emmanuel Levinas is so often cited as promoting, is the only possible basis for ethics in a society that is as fragmented as I just described. It is, I would say, the only possible basis for theological insight as well. To this, we must also add, and perhaps contrary to Levinas, it's debatable, that such encounter is not for the sake of the other remaining isolated in exotic strangeness, but genuinely encountered. That is, recognized as indispensable for our shared, never our isolated thriving. Back in the 1990s, queer activists insisting that their lives mattered during the global pandemic that marked that era urgently reminded us that silence equals death. In the throes of today's global ecological crisis, we must now deepen that clarion call further and insist that separation equals extinction. To heal the rift between us and all other species on this planet, a rift that has been widening for centuries, begins with encounter, not in gestures that objectify or commodify, but with genuine engagement across difference. I want to propose even further that this work of genuine encounter is not a burden. It's not onerous. It is, as the first act of erotic desire, actually desirable. We want and even long for such encounter, but we have been trained to suppose not only that we do not desire it, but also that such encounter with difference is risky and dangerous and foolhardy, and we must stay safe. We must now confront these vexations. We might call them cultural aperias, as we sequester ourselves for survival in the midst of global quarantines where many of us are experiencing the depths of erotic longing like never before. I am proposing here a theological animality as a healing corrective to the kind of theological anthropology that has dominated the modern West. The kind of anthropology that features comparative categorization. What it means for me to be human is to be not you. This notion of the other has, of course, generated the categorical classification schemes and their regulatory regimes with which we are so familiar, leading eventually to the identity politics most of us cannot imagine living without. David Abram takes this analysis further by noting that race, gender, and species are not actually distinct categories in practice, but shape a hierarchy of social value with each informing the others. Because humans are superior to all other species, for example, this brand of logic takes as axiomatic that men properly dominate women and that white Europeans ought to rule over people of color. The root of Western social distress is not that we treat other humans like animals. The root of our distress, rather, is how we treat all other animals. This first act, then, of a performative theological eroticism relies on encounter, not for the sake of absorbing difference in a superficial sameness that defines the colonial gesture of hegemonic imposition, nor for the sake of an objectified nor for the sake of an objectified distance in difference, right? Keeping the other as other, which is also a colonial posture of exoticization. Encounters that qualify erotically as genuine vibrate with vulnerability, inculcate postures of humility, and foster life-giving forms of interdependence. These are the very qualities, of course, that the modern West has for several centuries deflected away from the white male and toward the feminine and animal other. What this means for precarious ecosystems is the urgent need to foster communities of genuine encounter with other animals. People at PSR will know this. People laugh often when I say that I bring my Australian Shepherd dog Judah with me everywhere I go. He's right over here, by the way, next to me tonight. They laugh when I say that I bring Judah with me everywhere because of theological reasons. But it's true. We must be regularly encountering other animals, not only for sentimental reasons, but also for existential reasons of our own survival as a species and for the healing of the ecosystems we ourselves continue to decimate. Genuine encounter thus slides quickly and nearly imperceptibly into the second act of Eros, intimacy. What have decades of addressing sex and sexuality in Christian churches surfaced for our attention concerning intimacy? Among the key insights is this: intimacy is useless. Or rather, we ought to appreciate intimacy as a site to resist the relentless, utility-obsessed culture of commodification that late global capitalism has trained us to believe is normal and natural. I suspect that when I just referred to intimacy as useless, many of you assumed I meant that it has no value. Utility and value are not synonymous, except in an economic system that relies on resource extraction to satisfy sufficient profit margins for ongoing shareholder value of the kind that destroys entire ecosystems. Here, I'm going to bypass a series of arguments. It's going to be included in the published lecture. There are several sections like that I won't get to tonight, but here I'll bypass a series of arguments, including how even the notion of Sabbath has been co-opted as a method to make us more productive. And I'm going to skip ahead to this. The link between sexual intimacy and procreation is yet another brand of this obsession with usefulness and productivity. Do note that some strands of Christian traditions continue to insist that even if a couple does not produce a baby every time after having sexual intercourse, they ought at least to intend to do so. This approach to physical intimacy remains even in self-styled progressive and liberal communities. I confess here in public, I confess to having adopted this position myself in work I offered for the Blessings Project of the Episcopal Church, in which I argued that marriage can be procreative even without children, when the relationship creates the conditions for more productive work in the world. I cringe at this now, even though that argument helped to persuade a significant number of people, not a few of them bishops, to embrace the goodness of covenantal same-sex relationships because they can be productive. This notion of usefulness in a culture of commodification has made the horrifying system of factory farming not only possible, but in a sense, inevitable. Let us be clear about this, and I'm so sorry that I have to be tonight. Daily, hourly, relentless torture transpires on an industrial scale of monumental proportions in this country and elsewhere for the sake of providing a source of food for humans. 1 million farm animals are slaughtered every single hour in the United States alone. By the way, even the global pandemic has not slowed the slaughter because it is more economically viable for farms to kill all those animals than burn them and bury them rather than to feed them. Collectively, we permit this ongoing horror with the unspoken supposition that absolutely everything must have utility for us, must in some sense be a human-centric resource. Thus, in addition to cultivating communities of genuine encounter, we must also nurture communities of useless intimacy, where our relationships with each other and other animals and places are not productive of anything, where they produce nothing at all, but where the intimacy is an end in itself because it's healing. Here I offer a short interlude before Act 3, a brief return to that iconic scene along the banks of the Jordan River where John baptized his cousin Jesus. I stood at that gallery window, gazing on the painting that I referred to earlier, on one particular evening I'm having in mind right now. And I was seized there by theological questions of the kind that I'd been trained to ask, including, why was Jesus even baptized at all? The sinless Jesus had no need of repentance, which is what John's baptism signified. I recalled just then my love and terror of water, how I relish the sensation of swimming while also fearing unknown murky depths. Sin, I thought, was entirely the wrong frame for this icon, for this biblical story. If Jesus presents God to me, then the fleshy closeness between Jesus and John manifests God's solidarity with God's own creatures. A companionship to soothe loneliness and calm terrors. Or still more, this moment might signal a divine yearning for embodied encounter and unspeakable intimacy. I thought this, and the painting suddenly sang with unseen vocalists. There those religious figures stood naked, their feet sinking into the gritty bottom of the Jordan River, a riparian bed teeming with tiny worms and gestating larvae and decaying corpses, the detritus of a living ecosystem. There they stood naked, the waters of the Jordan River flowing around their bodies, the river rippling, unlike today, with fish. There they stood naked, the condition our ancient parents in Eden found so distasteful, an embarrassment, reason enough to hide from each other, and then from the garden, and then even from God. They hid because of shame, which so quickly erupted into violence in Cain's fratricidal gesture toward Abel. Those gospel figures stood there naked, immersed in these ancient legends, and a dove hovered nearby against a backdrop of Judean hillsides, slopes flush with goats and sheep and a distant camel. Now, except for the dove, the painter omitted all of those other creatures, from fish to goat. Yet all of them were there, invisibly present. So too in Christian theology and Christian liturgy and institutional Christianity, so many creatures omitted, all of them resiliently present. Indeed, Christian theology tends to obscure the deceptively simple fact of our animal existence, how entangled we are with other animals, how we ourselves are animals. The story Christians mostly tell instead is the human drama of falling and rising, for which Christ provides the redemptive means, as, by the way, the Lamb of God. The whole wide world of constant pain, suffering, and death of every other creature poses no question or problem in this standard Christian story at all, and I suddenly could not bear it, not while gazing on Jesus and John and the river. Perhaps sin, that word we liberals so love to hate, perhaps sin plays a role in this biblical scene after all, not as frame, but as depth. The sinless one seeks baptism not for repentance, but from empathy, born from encounter, and of the kind that demands intimacy. Plunging into the murky tides of human recklessness and violence, God joins us fully in the sweet ecstasies of fleshy existence and entirely with us in our alienated despair. There at the Jordan River, the incarnate Word of God stands naked, baptized in the whirl of countless creatures teeming all around him, beneath his feet, caressing his thighs, nipping at his testicles, flapping above his head, grazing on the river's banks and feeding there. So, how many were baptized in this story anyway? Far more than just one. I would propose that tens, even hundreds of thousands were baptized in this one moment, easily millions of creatures. As Denise Kimber Buell notes in her essay, The Microbes and Pneuma That Therefore I Am, the human body is constituted at best by no more than 10% of uniquely human cells. As John baptizes his cousin, so also he baptizes the countless microbial creatures that make up the body of Jesus, doesn't he? And wouldn't this matter in an age of ecological collapse? Is this nothing to you, all you who pass by? I wanted so desperately to ask that question to all those who barely noticed that painting on their way to the gay piano bar across the street. That question taken from the biblical book of Lamentations and most often asked in Christian traditions about the horrifying spectacle of Jesus on the cross. That question now sounds far more poignant to me at the Jordan River, a location I take these days as an analog for the factory farm few ever see, or the Texas Wildlife Park where wealthy humans hunt exotic animals shipped in from African and Asian continents, or the furrier where minks whine before their scalping and conversion into hats, or the salmon run decimated by irrigation diversions, or the Arctic Circle where drowning bears frantically try to save their cubs, or the puppy mill in the suburban mall where human toddlers squeal with delight over genetically modified canines, the ones whose mothers lay elsewhere, exhausted, malnourished, depleted from relentless impregnations. We must not look past that exhausted beagle, that drained Dalmatian, that utterly spent spaniel, and fail to see the history of institutional slavery in this country. The transatlantic slave trade itself was made illegal as early as 1808 in the United States, and then quickly was replaced by a version of factory breeding on southern plantations to ensure that supply for human capital would meet the demand. The suburban mall, the southern plantation, there is no difference. If this baptismal moment between Jesus and John is something and not nothing to all of us who pass by, what is it? It is nothing less than the Creator's breath, the Creator's breathtaking solidarity with all the flesh the Creator has ever made or will make. This baptismal moment depicts not only God's own embodied encounter with God's creation, not only God's own vulnerable intimacy with creaturely flesh, but also an immersive posture, a commitment to what some theologians have called a deep incarnation, and for which a manger in Bethlehem is simply not sufficient to evoke. The baptism of Jesus is an immersive act of the kind that prompts a notion, indeed the hope, of union, the third act of Eros. The third act, this performative act of Eros, has seemed particularly poignant during these last 2 months of sheltering in place because of the COVID-19 pandemic. This third act is union. The sheltering in place, this sequestering ourselves behind masks, gloves, goggles, and the reason for all of it, practicing what stands in profound contrast to the trajectory of erotic desire, distance. It just so happens that during this time of sheltering in place, I have also been teaching a course on Eros and Eucharist for social change. The students and I have been feeling together a heightened sense of longing and loss concerning physical connection. And so here I want to turn to some of their wonderful insights to help me frame this third act. I asked their permission to do this. Vitaly Osmolovsky succinctly and profoundly noted in a class discussion on Zoom, of course, that we cannot understand the most important things in life from a distance. We must do so by being close. This is the essence of union, or the unfolding of the self in the hopeful gestures of communion. This does not, by the way, necessitate genital sexual intimacy as the modern West usually assumes by default, though of course that is one of the God-given pathways towards such communion. Rather, Eros seeks multiple pathways for the offering of self, for the traversing of the space marked by distance, for the vulnerable surrender to the other, whether in deep friendship, collegial collaboration, interspecies companionship, or romantic ecstasy. Barbary Marchessault clarified further the distinction between this view of Eros and lust, between union and control, by noting how severely the commodification mechanisms of global capitalism frustrate our yearning to be at home in creation. Union or communion is thus not only comfort, but more directly a recalibration of the energies of life itself, which in turn issue forth in the kind of healing that resembles justice. Eurus Martinez is working on a project for that class to reframe our efforts for social justice not only as a matter of faithful obligation, but actually as a source of pleasure, as a response to erotic desire. This yearning for communion has become strikingly evident in the midst of our global economic shutdown and the reports many have read and then been desperate to believe concerning the rejuvenation of ecosystems, an Easter moment for Earth, as it were, and the persistence of citing these reports, even the ones that have been fabricated. As one writer in the Washington Post noted, we long to see Earth heal. We long for this so much that we will linger over fake news, even after knowing it's fake, because, I would say, we are starved for communion with Earth and for her countless creatures. Contemporary theologian Elizabeth Johnson, no relation, alas, would relate what that journalist reported to a posture of contemplation toward the natural world, which leads to what she calls a gaze of affection rather than an arrogant utilitarian stare. The emphasis Johnson places on contemplative prayer frames beautifully the urgent need for cultivating communities of genuine encounter and nurturing communities of useless intimacy as we seek to live in communities of divine communion for the sake of our healing and the planet's renewal. And so my conclusion, by the way, Judah is hoping that I will get to the conclusion. He's getting restless. My conclusion this evening points toward where I hope and yearn for this work to go. And I'll offer some prospects for that here, for what I want to call a mystical, ecological activism. Just briefly. These three performative acts, inspired by Eros, lead, perhaps in counterintuitive way, to a renewal of communities rooted in contemplative prayer, in communities devoted to an ecological mysticism. More than only counterintuitive, this proposal likely sounds irresponsible in an era that demands disruptive action. So we must be very clear about this, especially in the modern West. A life marked by contemplative prayer is not escapism if engaged erotically. That is, for the sake of intimacy and communion. Scholar of Christian monasticism, Douglas Christie, has noted, for example, that Eros is the energy that draws worlds together, that draws heaven and earth together, not for the sake of ownership and control, but in a tender embrace. The purpose, therefore, of contemplative prayer, according to Christie, is erotic union. As I have been suggesting repeatedly this evening, the immersive character of baptism provides an ideal image for this sense of embrace and union. And so I return for a third and final time to that iconic scene along the banks of the Jordan River, and this time with Charles Darwin at my side, who would envision that scene transpiring next to a tangled bank, where life and death commingle, where nothing is neat and tidy. Evolution is not a progression from one step to the next on graph paper. It is instead where life mixes always with death in a very untidy fashion to bring forth new life yet again. Darwin concluded the sixth and final edition of On the Origin of Species with that poetic image of a tangled bank, an image of life itself residing deep inside the knotty entanglements of multiple species, plants, insects, animals, each relying on all the others in a complex dance and weave of adaptation, mutation, and change. That tangled bank, with its unfathomable complexity and surging interrelations, served for Darwin as an image of the whole story of life, right there on one tangled bank. I would likewise point to the image of Jesus and John standing waist deep in water beside a river's tangled bank as an image of the whole gospel. The baptism of Jesus appears in the narrative imaginary of Christians not as a mere preface, nor only as an inaugural moment, like a skilled composer providing an opera's overture. All the musical themes and narrative subtleties are evoked and signaled by the gospel writers just there. The figures stand in water, the amniotic fluid of birth, the symbol of falling into death. They stand there in the company of other creatures and also with each other, the ones for whom it is not good to be alone, as the writer in Genesis declared. They stand also in solidarity with the marginal ones, signified by John's association with the Essenes, desert ascetics. The galvanizing claim of the gospel itself shines forth here too, as the divine word appears enfleshed, caressed by other fleshy creatures near a tangled bank. I now gaze on the baptism of Jesus and see the whole of God's astonishing reach, the divine embrace of God's entire creation, the whole flesh and blood of it, the unimaginable multiplicity of its creatures, their lives and histories, their births and deaths, the surging of a divine ecology. We, all of us, now stand in desperate need of this vision and what it can inspire and animate our communities to do. The vision unfolds in movements of encounter, intimacy, and union. The performative acts of Eros that appear not just coincidentally in nearly every mystical path of nearly all of the world's religious traditions. It may now be the only path sufficient to counter effectively the commodification culture of owning and controlling that has converted Earth into a gigantic warehouse of resources to use and burn for capitalist development, as the 19th century sociologist Max Weber prophetically warned. The mystic, by contrast, does not seek to own, but strives to let go and give away. Mystical contemplation, much like baptism, is a process of immersion, a process of immersing the self in the works of God. Letting go into immersion is the arc traced by Eros, a performance of giving the self away, not merely to find the self, the classic gesture of narcissistic justification, but to be vulnerable to union, to communion, which nearly every mystic cautions us about, because communion does not merely uncover the self, but dramatically changes it. And explicitly, ecological mysticism would, in that sense, offer conversion to the alienated Western self, which has been exported around the world through various colonial outposts and is manifested as guilt, shame, violence, self-hatred, commodification, extraction, exploitation, and oppression, or more simply, bad religion. And so, Jesus is submerged within a watery womb and invites us to follow him into what Paul called a tomb, and where life may yet pulsate again, throbbing with the beatings of a restless, sacred heart. This is not a movement of supposedly good religion to counter the bad. This is actually queer religion, which is not the rejection of religion per se, but the reconstruction adoption. Get it back to that sentence. This is not the rejection of religion per se, but the reconstructed adoption of what it once marked. The regular, routine rhythm that is not only ritual, but breath. Not only chanted tempo, but heartbeat. Not only the punctuation of a procession, but the very pulse of a planet. The baptism of Jesus is queer religion in iconic form, because there is in that moment, which has no end, no distance between God and matter. Pause and reflect with me on that startling claim and its potential to heal our deepest distress. There is no distance between God and matter. Jesus is immersed in the tide, in the river, in the spittle of a French kiss with earth. The baptism of Jesus is the very eros of God enfleshed, and thus the source of our healing. It matters that I embarked on the journey that led to a claim like that because of the moment many years ago when I refused to choose between my Christian faith and being gay. A refusal John E. Boswell made not merely palatable, but rendered as a divine calling. Let us not take such a moment for granted, not even in 2020. I am not a Christian despite being gay. I am rather a better Christian for having embraced my queerly gay identifications. The complex intertwining of these bodily identifications, and they are both irreducibly embodied, helped me to see that Christian faith inspires the hope of at long last being at home. I mean, being at home in our own bodies without any shame, being at home among other bodies without any guilt, and at home with God without any fear. And to live at home in each of these ways at once is to live as agents of ecological healing. Jesus is baptized to bring us home to our bodies, and he is baptized erotically with his cousin to bring us home to our bodily relations. And he is baptized in a river to make our shared home with the Creator God, whose very life flows through our veins just as it flowed through an ancient garden in Genesis, just as its streams make glad the city of God, as the psalmist declared, just as it waters the tree in the revelation to John, whose leaves are for the healing of the nations. Not just some of the nations, but all of them. Cherokee and German, Irish and Pachyderm, Nigerian and Arachnid, Taiwanese and Avian, to name but a scarce few of them. Shall we then gather at the river? Please take me to that river where Paul met the industrious women in the Acts of the Apostles, the dealers in purple cloth, the heads of their own households in the first century, likely among the very first leaders of a Christian church. Please take me to the river where enslaved Africans in the American South crossed on their way to freedom, and who sang as they swam the songs that might still call a nation to repentance and healing. Take me to the river where desperate migrants and climate refugees seek to cross for their children, because if they weren't desperate, they would never put their own children at such risk. Please take me to the river where those bright angel feet have trod with all the dear and precious saints of God. They dance in the silver spray, their worship our lure to the happy golden day. And yes, take me to the river called Styx, over which the dead are shuttled for entry into Hades, because I need not live with fear ever again. Not the fear of guilt, not the fear of shame, not the fear of never being worthy of the attention of the God who made me, not even the fear of death, precisely because of the river where Jesus is baptized, where the Word of God is immersed into the creative work of God, forever altering both for the good. This is the erotic work of the Word of God made flesh, to unite what has been separated, to heal what has been fragmented and torn apart, to serve as host, bride, and bridegroom all at once at the wedding feast that has been prepared from the foundation of the world. This is the much overlooked, still, gift of LGBTQ people and our communities. The standalone significance of our erotic bodily lives. Standalone because our bodily lives are not just for something else, like procreation in a commodified economic system of exchange. No, our bodily lives are in and of themselves, without any further utility or function, the site of epiphany and divine creaturely entanglement, and thus a source of renewal and healing at a moment when earth is sorely wounded. This is why the so-called Boswell thesis remains important. To put the matter simply and urgently, and to conclude, the work queer theologians attempt concerns not whether synagogues, churches, and mosques will include people like me, because we have always been there, as Boswell insisted. But rather, the question is whether religious institutions of all kinds will embrace the process of enfleshing Eros that so many queer people have done for millennia, and thereby travel together more securely and more surely on a path that leads toward the healing of earth. Thank you for your kind attention this evening.
Thank you, Jay. We have several questions, and so use the Q&A box if you would like to add a question, and we have about 12 minutes or so. Jay, the first question, I'm quoting it. So, I can feel the tension in my commitment to serve others and heal the world between usefulness and useless intimacy. I have resisted the commodification of my desire to contribute, but I keep getting caught up in my earning my place in the community and not wanting to be a burden to others. And yet, I have felt the gloriously intimate vulnerability in taking care of others. Do you have any insight into unentangling usefulness and useless intimacy?
What a fantastic question. And part of what I want to say about that is one could argue with me a little bit that if intimacy is healing, as I suggested that it was, then perhaps there is some usefulness to intimacy. So it isn't entirely useless. I'm using the notion of a useless intimacy in order to provoke some deeper awareness, or awareness at all, of the extent to which commodification has infiltrated every single aspect of our lives, to the point that unless we can dig it up, burn it, sell it, or commodify it, it isn't of any value. And the way that this happens with our bodies and our relationships, even shouldn't even say even, but including also our religious institutions and religious rites, we need a way to break that cycle of productivity, of constantly needing to be useful. Walter Brueggemann, what I didn't include in my lecture tonight is a section in the paper itself on Walter Brueggemann's wonderful work with Sabbath, and the way that Sabbath has been, as I just mentioned briefly in the lecture, the way that Sabbath has been co-opted by precisely this system of commodification, such that we think we have to rest for the purpose of being more productive in the week to come, which is exactly not the purpose of Sabbath in the Hebrew Bible. That's not a very good response to that question, except to say, if we're doing something with our intimacy that breaks that cycle of constantly needing to be productive, that's what I think is healing about it.
Thank you. Another question, do you have suggestions for engaging with Christians who hold fast to dominion theology?
That's tough. And if what I'm, and maybe quickly, Leonard, I see that you're the one who put that question in there. Do you mean by dominion theology, do you mean the notion that God somehow, according to the text in Genesis, has given humans dominion over all other creatures and so on? I'm suspecting, yes, I see the yes in the chat box. Okay. Right. So there's a lot going on in those first couple of chapters of Genesis. And I would urge us, this is also related, by the way, to, and I was kind of wondering if this would come up. It's related to the notion that humans are created in the image and likeness of God, according to the Genesis storyteller. What is so interesting to me, one of the things that I would say and have said to Christians who sort of are countering my arguments with that biblical image of the image and likeness of God, usually what I will say is, so what is exactly the image and likeness of God? Because actually the biblical text doesn't say what the image and likeness of God is. And all three of the Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have dozens of candidates in their traditions and our traditions for what the image and likeness of God is. There is no consensus about what that is. And therefore, in my view, there is no need to read that text as if it is making humans superior to all other creatures. In fact, I think, and some commentators have suggested that one could read image and likeness of God as a vocation, as a calling, that God is calling on us as a species to be the ones who actually care for God's creation, perhaps even as God's friends, as creation's friends. Some commentators have suggested. And then if you remember what Jesus said, that no greater love is than this, than someone who lays down their life for their friends. We need to be laying down our lives for God's creation, not burning it, is what I would say.
Thank you. A question about whether extractive consumerism at the suburban mall is the same as Southern slavery, which extracted and used up human resource.
Thank you. Excellent question. I wanted to be, this is an ongoing, highly controversial part of how animal studies has been adopted in Christian theology and in other academic fields. And part of what I'm getting at here is the way that we tend to compare and contrast levels of suffering or levels of oppression or levels of violence. And of course, I don't want to say that the puppy mill in the suburban mall is absolutely equivalent to the horrors of the breeding farms on southern plantations in the 19th century. Of course, I don't want to make that an equivalence. However, I do want us to note that they are also not entirely distinct. There is the same gesture of the commodification of bodies. And also, I would argue, as others have, that the way that we treat other animals tends to give us implicit permission to treat certain segments of human populations the same way. So if we have no problem treating the beagle with constant impregnations, why not? It's where we're making other puppies and stuff. The same logic gets applied to humans. We can argue whether that's making an equivalence. I don't think it is. I think it's noting that the logic is the same and that we have to break the logic with all animals.
Thank you. Another one. Have you encountered Mary McGann's discussion connecting deep incarnation with Jesus' baptism as an act of solidarity with creation, calling us to see our baptism as an act of solidarity as well?
Yes, I have. And I'm eager to actually talk with Professor McGann. I know that she teaches at the Jesuit school here at the GTU, and I know that she has been working on a kind of watershed, a theology of the watershed, which and relating it to baptism, so that there's a relationship. I may not be getting this right, but this is what I'm recalling from some conversations. I'm really super eager to talk with her some more about that. I'll just say part of what's lurking around and what I'm doing here in this lecture with the baptism of Jesus, with the image of the river and so on, is also borrowing from Eastern Orthodox traditions that tend to emphasize much more than the West does the baptism. The Eastern Orthodoxy refers to the baptism of Jesus as the theophany. That's the manifestation of the Word of God in the flesh, right there at the baptism. Western Christians tend to see the baptism as just kind of preface or kind of an inaugural moment. Eastern Orthodoxy sees it as almost really the atonement, almost the salvific moment for humanity.
Are you ready for some more?
Sure, why not?
Okay, good.
Let's keep going.
So I think I heard you use communion and union interchangeably or as synonyms. Do you indeed see these words as synonymous, or is there any significant nuance between the two?
Great question. And that nice attention to that. I appreciate that. I was trying to, not so subtly, suggest that in that third act of Eros, union, is lurking around the Eucharist, or what we mean by communion. And so I do sometimes use them interchangeably and synonymously. I think there's some good reason to notice that there are some differences and to make some distinctions between them. But I think trying to be as, I know this is Dr. Schlager's favorite word, as fulsome as possible about the notion of communion and union being really that, being united, union, which I sometimes think gets lost in the stylized gestures of our liturgical rites. So that's why I'm rambling around that question a little bit. But thank you, Andrew, for it.
How can Eros and a sense of unity reconcile with the competing interests of nations, ethnicities, classes, and between ourselves, so that we can come together for a healing of the environment, of the earth?
So not too small a question, Joseph. Thank you. So I'm pausing because something that approaches a sufficient answer to that question would be way too long for us this evening. But what I'm pondering, that really important question, is the role of nation states right now is severely called into question. I've been reading a lot, not only among academics, but political commentators and so on, about what this global pandemic is calling to our attention. Sometimes, yes, the need for even more stronger national policies, but others are saying, the era of the nation state is fading away, and it's not about some big world government that we need to be talking about, but maybe talking about localized communities and neighborhoods. And I love, people at PSR know I love William T. Cavanaugh's work, a theologian who works a lot in the importance of the local parish of all things, where we can actually be doing the work of building the kind of community that we believe our religious traditions actually are calling us to build, and then network those communities for social change and transformation. Instead of Christians are constantly acquiescing huge, important parts of our traditions, like the common good, to governments. What would a government have to know about the common good? Anyway, it's a much longer question, but it's a great question, Joseph. I see that, by the way, Bernie, I see that SOTH Berkeley wants to know if the paper, yes, so the paper will be available, the longer version of this lecture, which is a paper. Yeah.
And that'll be on our website.
Eventually.
2 more questions?
Sure.
Okay, so thank you for your heart-melting articulation about Eros. While a lot of us are aware that we are burdened by false beliefs about Eros and shame, my question is, how do you suggest we can get past that shame about bodily reality, the gnawing feeling of brokenness?
One of the things that really important question, thank you for it, raises for me, and I try to say this in my classes all the time. And in fact, I didn't model with this lecture what I urge my students to do. So I'll confess that. And whenever we are talking about eros or erotic desire, I think it's really super important that we remember that every single gathering of humans will have some percentage of them as those who have suffered from some kind of sexual abuse or domestic violence or some kind of bodily trauma, for which even the words eros and eroticism can be triggering. And so we need to be pastorally aware of that and deal with it carefully and astutely. Part of the reason I'm saying that is because Christian churches on the main have not been addressing, as we well know, issues of bodily trauma, certainly not of shame. What I've tried to do in my work is to notice that churches have mostly read the 3rd chapter of Genesis that I evoked a little bit this evening as being a story primarily about guilt, and therefore have stressed atonement and forgiveness as the answer, if you will, to the problem of guilt. But there's this other aspect in Genesis 3 that is so terribly important, which is about bodily shame, which was what I was trying to get at in part this evening. And atonement and forgiveness will not solve the problem of shame. You cannot forgive me for being ashamed of myself. The only way to heal my shame is for me to be loved out of it. And so what I would say, that is love as healing. And I think what theologians, all the way back to the first few centuries of Christian traditions, model for us is that when you're trying to address the issue of bodily shame, you don't go to atonement and forgiveness, you go to incarnation and love. You go to the word of God becomes flesh, is immersed in our human condition to love us. That's how we heal from shame. And that's how we also become agents of healing for earth. So I would say the way that we have to do this is to be creating and nurturing and sustaining communities, as I tried to suggest tonight, of genuine encounter and of intimacy and of communion. I'm ordained in the Episcopal Church. So I am a great fan of the parish for all its faults. And the local parish is the place where we need to have trained, ready leaders and pastors to facilitate that kind of healing community for ourselves, and as I tried to urge us tonight, for the healing of earth.
One more question, or?
Sure.
Okay, so we are near the end of Ramadan, and since Boswell's first book dealt with Muslims in Al-Andalus, can you add some statement about Islam, sexuality, and ecology? And this person notes that they hosted Boswell at Hollywood United Methodist Church about a year before his death. Boswell was very proud of his fluency in Arabic and read the Quran daily.
Actually, Dr. Schlager was a student of John Boswell's at Yale and may be able to answer this question much better than I can. And I also know, by the way, that folks at the GTU, the Graduate Theological Union, of which PSR is a member school, there's a lot that's going on right now around ecological concerns and environmental concerns that will, I'm very hopeful about that and very excited about the possibility of genuine interreligious, interfaith work on the urgent need for ecological renewal and climate justice. I've only been vaguely aware, sort of on the sidelines, a little bit of my understanding of Boswell's own engagement with Islam. I don't know, Bernie, did you want to say anything about it?
No, it's been many years since I read that book, The Royal Treasure. It does not speak to ecology as I remember it, but I would have nothing to add.
Cool. Actually, can you do that next one, just because Peter is a dear friend of mine?
I think you may know the questioner, sure. So I freely admit that I'm finding the implications of a diet a struggle for me, and yet it seems that for a religious tradition that holds the incarnation, literally the enfleshment, as the core of its faith, attention to embodiment, and not just human embodiment, is a confessional necessity, not just a pleasant opportunity. Any suggestions for how we might actually think incarnationally about the fact that life is sustained by other life.
Yep. Thank you, Peter. So Donna Haraway. The Donna Haraway is an amazing scholar and writer, and the reason she came immediately to mind is because she's been helping me as I read. I don't know her personally, that's not what I mean, but reading her stuff has been helping me think about what in the world literally to do about this question of diet. I have been, and if I'm understanding your question correctly, Peter, Dr. Carlson, I may have, you may be referring to what I was evoking a little bit concerning factory farming and the way that the system of factory farming relies on daily, hourly torture as a source of food for us as humans. So the question of diet is a very important one, I would say, concerning ethics, not and just common decency. What happens on factory farms, it's sequestered from our view for a reason. If we saw what happened there, so few of us would be willing to eat meat if we saw what happened at factory farms. But the reason I mentioned Donna Haraway is because we don't have to make this into a completely binary choice here. It's either we eat other animals and participate in the factory farm system that is horrific, or we don't eat any other animals or any other animal products. And I know that some think that that is exactly the choice that we're faced with right now. I'm sympathetic to that, but I don't think we have to go the binary route in that way. Donna Haraway, for example, suggests that we can actually refuse to eat other animals that had been produced by the factory farming system, and that would be a great step in the right direction. Not only for the sake of the animals themselves, but also because factory farms produce some of the worst global climate change gases and all of that stuff. So it's horrible for the environment as well. Haraway also makes really compelling arguments about the importance of mindful eating. So the way that we are engaging in a kind of mindfulness practice about what we eat, and not only if that includes other animals, but everything, the way that we are on the planet, adopting a much more mindful approach can be a much better way to live, or at least getting closer to living peaceably and harmoniously with the environments of Earth. An inadequate answer to a very important question. Personally, I'm not fully a vegetarian yet, but I am on that slow road there. I don't really eat beef or pork anymore. That was for quite some time now. But anyway, yeah.
Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for being our 13th annual CLGS John E. Boswell lecturer. Really, thank you very much.
A delight.
Thank you, everyone. I have an announcement to make, and if I might share my screen. As we conclude our event tonight, I did want to share with you something that CLGS has done over the years. The CLGS Leading Voice Award honors those who lead us into the work of social justice, scholarship, and pastoral ministry to realize broader visions of welcoming faith communities. Every year, the center staff honors these voices as a way to lift up such courageous and inspiring witness in a religious and secular culture where such voices are often overlooked or even unheard. And so tonight, the staff for the Center for LGBTQ and Gender Studies in Religion here at Pacific School of Religion is very proud to present Reverend Dr. J. Emerson Johnson with the CLGS Leading Voice Award. And allow me to read the proclamation, if I might. It's one of the few times in my life I get to proclaim. For distinguished service as teacher, scholar, and priest, and for pioneering work to advance LGBTQ inclusion in church and society, CLGS recognizes you, Jay, as a leading voice. Congratulations. And
you know, I helped to write a lot of those proclamations over the years. I'm very touched. Thank you, Bernie. Very touched.
You're welcome, and the entire staff. And finally, as we wrap up this evening, everyone, we want to not only thank Professor Johnson for tonight's lecture, but also, somewhat sadly for the center and the entire PSR community, to bid Jay a farewell and Godspeed at the end of this academic year. Jay has recently accepted the call to be the next rector of All Saints Episcopal Church in Saugatuck, Michigan. Jay began his professional life as a full-time parish priest, and now he returns to that work in a part of the country where he was born and grew up. While we will miss you, Jay, here at CLGS, PSR, the GTU, the entire Bay Area, we trust that the divine will bless you, Jay, and your ministry abundantly in Saugatuck.
So everybody has to come and visit. That's all there is to it. Thank you.
Beautiful. So good night, everyone. Thank you all for attending our annual John E. Boswell lecture. We will stay on the site here for
yes,
several
and
minutes.
actually, I've got a little bit of music, some upbeat, wonderful music, some images of rivers, and some more baptism. If you want to hang out a little bit more and chat in the chat room, that would be awesome. And here's a little bit of music. It's sort of, let's go to the river. And thank you all. It's been fantastic. I really appreciate your questions. So let me share my screen. Here we go. Oops, wait a minute. Wait a minute. We need to get, share computer sound. Okay, there we go. There we go. forward.